I'm Dr. Allana Coffee, and thank you for joining us today. I have with me Dr. Leena Mohapatra. She's going to say it better in just a minute, but I'm so honored to have her. She and I are both serving on the steering committee for diversity and equity with the Honolulu Psychological Association. Our aim is to have conversations, curate information, and bring psychology really just to the people and have you hear about what some of our scientists are studying and why it's relevant and important to you. You might notice that, yes, we are outside and there is ambient noise. Chickens, dogs, cats, planes, it's all happening. And part of that is because it's just a respectful thing for our psychologists that we are outside at the time of COVID, that we are having a safe distance communication that is at least friendly and collegial. It's really nice to see you in person.
So nice to see you.
We've been meeting on Zoom, online, and but it's really wonderful and lovely to see you. And thank you for making the time to be here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So what I was noticing about, we'll just kind of launch into our discussion.
Sure.
And I was noticing on your resume that you're relatively new to Hawaii.
I am.
Yes, yes. Can you tell us about how you've come to the islands?
Yeah, so I have moved around a lot. I think, like, you know, when we're in the process of training, right, as doctoral students, and then you go on your internship and you go on your fellowship, like I managed to travel a lot to a lot of different places. And then I thought I was going to be settled in Baltimore, which is where I started working. And then I met my husband, and my husband is U.S. Army, and our first station together after we got married was here. So we didn't have to plan a honeymoon, which was nice.
Right, what a romantic guy.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service as a spouse. Thank you for that. Okay, talk about your experience with psychology. And well, before we go to that, I promised that you would say your name. Say it, it's beautiful.
Sure. So my last name is Mohapatra is how I usually say it for everyone because it helped to break it down phonetically. The actual Indian way of saying it is Mohapatra.
But that Patra is like Cleopatra, though, right?
Yeah,
it's
it is.
Like,
It is like that. So yeah, it's my parents are from the eastern side of India, from a state called Orissa, and so it's a pretty common name there, which is good. And so yeah, so that's where we come from. So my parents came here. Actually, my father came here in '73 to do his doctorate work, and then went back and married my mother, and they came here and. Here I am.
I love it. I love it. And so what does your name mean?
So Leena means devoted.
Yes.
And Mohapatra means big pot, which is always big pot, big stone.
Hey.
So yeah, it's
My
kind of
last
funny.
name is Coffee. We got together.
Yes.
Big pot of coffee. Here we are.
I love it.
Anyway. So, and what was your dad's study? What did he study then?
Yeah. My dad was, he came and did his doctorate in material sciences. So a lot of stuff on looking at like how materials function and their properties. So he was very much like what people often call that hard science.
Right.
And so, yeah, he did a lot of things with developing like the films for mammograms.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of what he ended up doing was in radiology. So, which was kind of, it's really cool.
Wow.
He's retired now, but
right.
yeah.
You know, you're mentioning hard science, and we psychologists consider ourselves scientists, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we spend hundreds and maybe even thousands of hours in our pursuit, in our study, because it's not just our opinion. We're actually basing much of what we do on observed fact and curated knowledge. So we don't consider ourselves hard scientists, but soft scientists. But I am curious about your field of study. What did you study?
So I kind of have gone a little bit all over the place, but I actually really found, so I think it's interesting when we talk about this hard science, soft science. When I told my family I wanted to go from medicine into psychology, it was a little bit like, ooh, what does that mean? And I remember, like, culturally, you grew up hearing not just your parents, you hear everyone else kind of talking about what it means to be a scientist. And family friends would also be like, they didn't know how to approach me and ask me about psychology either, because it was a science that they didn't seem to understand. And So for me, it was interesting because like when I started doing psychology, like I kind of decided at the last minute that I was going to major in psychology in undergrad. I was a dance major for the first 3 years, which was.
Your parents are truly patient and kind.
I think it's really important to like explore the art side. We
Yes.
come from an arts family too, so it was easy to kind of convince them as long as I was going into something else later on. But yeah, I think, when I declared my major, I ended up working with a neuropsychologist. And that was really fascinating to me because it actually blended a lot of the
Right.
things that I was really interested in. It blended
medicine.
it blended kind of the more medical, biological pieces of neurology, and then it also brought into play just understanding how that really impacts people in their day-to-day functioning. But for me, I worked with individuals who had bipolar and schizophrenia, and we were doing something as basic as just eye tracking and seeing how that related to symptom count, and really thinking like, well, eye tracking is important because its basis in those neurological systems are also the systems that get impacted by these mental health conditions. And so for me, when I started that was like this perfect blend, and it started to make me realize like, I think this is what makes sense to me. So I ended up taking my MCATs and then decided that I didn't want to go into that direction for medicine, but really went into the neuropsychology aspect, and I ended up doing a lot of work with kids with autism. So I did a lot of ABA as an undergrad, as a grad student, kind of early on, and I was like, this is what I want to do. I had all these questions about just how kids with autism really start to learn and generalize information. Like, how do you generalize all these interventions so that it makes sense for them in their day-to-day world? And so it was my research, a lot of it was on looking at brain function. So I would have kids with autism who didn't have autism. We would look at EEG. We would do a lot of assessments, like play observation in addition to, like cognitive assessments. And we would integrate all that information to kind of make sense of the data that we were looking at. And so that was what I was really interested in, is really looking at how those kind of neural underpinnings manifest in our behavioral presentations.
Amazing. Okay. What percentage of the United States population roughly is on that spectrum, the autism spectrum disorder? If you were to,
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't looked at the recent CDC. I think a couple years ago it was like 1 in 85 is what they were saying is kind of the number of individuals. I will say that it's always interesting to see, because I think our definition of the spectrum has kind of altered and changed, and some are more liberal with diagnoses than others, but generally speaking, I think 1 in 85.
Right, right. And that 1 in 85 also includes now the diagnosis that with DSM-5 Asperger's was kind of included now in autism spectrum disorder, whereas they used to be two separate things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is, it maybe even had changed a little bit. I haven't looked at recent numbers in all fairness. But yeah, I think, when you think of that spectrum, definitely those with Asperger's kind of naturally fall on that spectrum. So.
Right, right. Tell us what you're doing now in the state of Hawaii, because like your study is vast. So what have you narrowed into? You could have done anything, but what have you done?
I haven't really narrowed. I feel like I keep broadening and broadening what I do. But no, I think, coming to Hawaii, it was interesting as a neuropsychologist because there wasn't hospitals that had neuropsychologists, specifically pediatric neuropsychologists in their settings. So I kind of wound up looking into the DOE and kind of function as a neuropsychologist within the DOE, which I think has made me realize a lot of, I've always wondered about our testing and what we do, because everywhere I've lived, I've worked with different populations, and you always have to take into account like biases in your testing, and you always have to take into account like what exactly is this assessment measuring. And I think that for me, that's something that I've found really interesting in terms of working here in Hawaii and like looking at our assessment tools and understanding like what is the utility of it and what function does it have.
Yes.
And so I think I've definitely broadened, and I'm now doing a lot more clinical and neuropsychology in my work, but I also feel a lot more drawn to like understanding some of those multicultural aspects of our assessment tools and really being better both at supervision and just also when I'm talking and working with my students and patients about like, what does this really mean in your day-to-day? Like,
Right.
what is average to whom?
Right, right. It's very controversial, actually, that whole testing, and especially the intersectionality with culture and ethnicity,
Yeah.
right? So how do you navigate those waters?
So for me, what's interesting is that I think this is why neuropsychology always has made sense to me, because at our core, we all have a brain that is created very universally. Like your language centers are your language centers. Your frontal lobe does very similar things across everywhere you go. And that doesn't change even when you look at literature on like people who are bilingual and how like their brains kind of start to learn second languages and where those locations are. Like that happens universally, whatever language you're learning. So for me, that's a comfort in neuropsychology. And the assessment tools, I always think about them as not like, I never think about my tools as being a definitive, but I think of it as a process. And so I approach my testing and looking at for more of a process-oriented view. And I think that is a lot easier for me to help understand. So it's not just like you are deficient in this, but there's differences in your language and how you see things spatially, and what could be the reason for that. Is that because of biology, or is that because of just family environment? Like, is your family more geared towards doing things outdoors and navigating kind of space, and that's why that area for you is much more strengthened, whereas there are maybe individuals who have a much more verbal household, and so that may mean that those kids may have higher language scores. So rather than thinking of good or bad, but really thinking like, what does it mean as your total you? And I think that is how I navigate assessment and assessment tools to make sense.
I appreciate you saying that for our viewer and our listener, because testing has got so many different meanings and implications for people, and what you basically did is just demystify it, and it is a helpful tool as opposed to a tracking tool or a othering tool, right? Thank you for the way you've described that. I do want to ask you about DESC. We're on this committee together, and what brought you to DESC, and what did you hope to gain by being on the Diversity and Equity Steering Committee?
Yeah, and I think, it was interesting. It kind of formed in, all of the, for lack of better words, craziness, but really all of the problems that were really brought to the forefront last year. And it's always been there. Like, I was in Baltimore during Freddie Gray. I'm from Minnesota. It feels very personal in many ways, that these are things that continue to occur within society. And so I think for me, that was my first kind of point. And then I realized actually coming to Hawaii was interesting for me, because I realized I wasn't in a setting where everyone thought like me. And I say that in a good way. I think being on the East Coast, being in academic medical centers, there is a little bit of homogeneity of how we think about the world. And it was really eye-opening to me and good, because I was like, okay, I think one of the things I really need to learn and work on is how do we have these conversations, and what is really important in when it comes to kind of diversity and equity, and what does it mean? And I actually started to look at this as a way for my own personal growth. And figuring out how to really start having these conversations. But then it also brings me back to the reasons why I really wanted to be a psychologist, which was I, growing up, realized like culturally, there were no Indian psychologists, and we did not talk about mental health, and we didn't really acknowledge it. And I remember thinking, I would look around and see all of, my friends, and I was like, it's so hard to be bicultural. Like, we don't know how to navigate the worlds and these kind of opposing, or what we think are opposing, viewpoints. And we had a lot of mental health struggles that no one wanted to address. Like, it was like, just, we'll sign you up for something else and it'll magically disappear. And so kind of going back to that, I was like, I think this is something that I need for my own personal growth, and also to think about like, who is it I want to be as a clinician as I move forward? Because I'm not done, but the early career stuff has slowly started to kind of dwindle down, and now I get to focus on like who I want to be, because I feel like my skills as a neuropsychologist are pretty solid. So now it's like I feel like I'm in that path, like, okay, how do I want to live my profession from here on out? And doing things like this and being part of desk and growing and hearing how everyone talks about things and just learning has been incredibly beneficial to me.
Right. Wow. I mean, like, we could go on.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. I know, like, all day. I love it. And you know, that is the beauty and really the true wealth that we have in the state. We have great minds here. And, you know, thank you for lending us yours. You're right. Hawaii is extremely diverse. And that is a strength of Hawaii. And I don't think that we get to hear from each other enough. So I really appreciate you coming and just letting people know that you're here. And if they wanted to know more about the things that you study or the things that you plan to study, how would a person, you know, how do they find you? You know, like, do you have a website yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm working on it. Hopefully the goal is to have a private practice sometime kind of soon. But my LinkedIn profile is probably the best place to find out more about me.
Right. Mohapatra.
Yep.
Hey, I did want to ask you, what was your favorite type of dance that you studied?
Oh, so I still dance actually.
Nice.
But I actually really love classical Indian dance. And so the part of India my family's from, which is Odisha, like the type of dance from there is Odissi. And that's actually something in the last year I've been very fortunate here. There's a teacher on Maui, and she does virtual lessons, and so I've been able to like now also like take in a little bit more of my culture as an adult.
Wow.
And learn that dance. But Indian classical dance has always been what I've loved
Chicken
and done.
skin, chicken skin. That's so beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for joining us. This is Dr. Mohapatra. She's fabulous, and thanks for joining us today. Aloha.